A huge gun rights ruling just slammed the brakes on the Justice Department, and most people still do not understand how big this is. Because if you hear the headline and miss the fine print, you could walk away with the exact wrong idea about what the law still allows. Before we go any further, quick question for you. Are you subscribed yet? Because this channel breaks down major gun law changes in plain English, and what I am about to explain could save you from making a very expensive mistake. Hit that subscribe button right now so you do not miss what comes next. So here is what just happened. On June 18, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court handed the DOJ a major defeat in a case called United States v. Hemani, and this was not some close 5-2 for ruling. It was a 9-2-0 decision. That means every justice agreed the government went too far in this case. Now let me break down what the government tried to do. Federal law has a section called 18 U.S.C. 922 G3. In simple terms, it says an unlawful user of a controlled substance cannot possess a gun. The DOJ used that law to prosecute a Texas man named Ali Hemani. According to the court's opinion, Hemani admitted he used marijuana about every other day, and he also had a gun. In his home, the government said that fact alone was enough to charge him with a federal crime, and here is the part that shocked a lot of people. The government was not claiming he used the gun in a crime. They were not saying he threatened someone. They were not saying he was drunk, high, violent, or out of control at the moment he had the gun. They were basically saying, if you regularly use marijuana, you automatically lose your gun rights under this law. Period. The Supreme Court said no, not like this. The court said the DOJ's prosecution of Hemani was inconsistent with the Second Amendment. In plain English, the government could not just point to his regular marijuana use and say that alone made it constitutional to prosecute him as a felon for having a gun at home. That is why this is such a major defeat for the DOJ. This was not just losing on a technical detail. The government made a broad argument, and the court rejected it. Now, why did the court do that? The first big reason was history. Ever since the Bruen case, courts have been asking whether a gun restriction fits with America's historical tradition of firearm regulation. The DOJ tried to compare this drug user ban to old laws aimed at what they called habitual drunkards. Sounds clever, right? But the court said that comparison did not hold up. The justices explained that those old laws usually targeted people who were deeply impaired, people who could not manage their affairs, or people who had gone so far that they were basically incapacitated. That is very different from saying a person who uses marijuana on a regular basis automatically loses the right to keep a firearm. Most people think the government just has to say, well, drugs are dangerous, guns are dangerous, so the law makes sense. But the court said that is not enough. The government has to show a real historical match, and in this case it failed. Second, the court looked at how the law worked in practice. The DOJ's position was basically automatic disarmament. The moment you become an unlawful user, you lose your gun rights, no matter what drug, what amount, whether you were dangerous, whether you kept the gun safely, or whether you ever threatened anyone. The court was clearly bothered by how broad that was. Think about that for a second. Under the government's theory, a person could be calm, working a steady job, keeping a gun at home for self-defense, never hurting anyone, and still face up to 15 years in prison just because of marijuana use. The court said that kind of blanket rule was too much under the Second Amendment, at least on these facts. And here is the crazy part people are going to miss. This does not mean every drug user can now legally own a gun in every situation. It does not mean all federal gun restrictions just disappeared. It does not mean the court struck down every part of 922G, and it definitely does not mean you should assume you are safe just because you heard one headline online. This ruling was narrow, very narrow. The court said it was not deciding cases involving addicts. It was not deciding cases involving people who are presently intoxicated. It was not deciding the ban on felons having guns. It was not deciding whether the government could bring a case with individualized proof that a specific person's drug use made him dangerous. That is a huge point. In other words, the DOJ lost this battle, but the war over this law is far from over. If this breakdown is helping you, imagine what you will get from the next video, where I explain the exact words that can keep a simple police encounter from turning into a legal disaster. Subscribe now so you do not miss that one. Now let me explain why this ruling matters so much to regular gun owners. First, it shows the Supreme Court is still serious about forcing the government to justify gun laws with actual history, not just fear, not just policy arguments, and not just broad claims that a group might be risky. That matters because a lot of gun laws get defended with emotional arguments. The government often says a law is common sense, so courts should uphold it. But after Bruen and now again in Hemani, the court is saying common sense is not the legal test. History is the test. Second, this ruling hits a very sensitive issue in America right now, and that is marijuana. Here is the messy truth. A lot of states have legalized marijuana in some form. Some allow medical use, some allow recreational use, some allow both. So many people assume that if their state says marijuana is legal, then their gun rights are untouched. That is where people get burned. Under federal law, marijuana is still treated as a controlled substance in many contexts, and federal gun law has long treated unlawful users as prohibited persons. That conflict has trapped a lot of people in confusion. They think my state says this is legal, so I must be fine, but federal law does not always care what your state allows. That is one reason this case got so much attention. It exposed the growing gap between state marijuana laws and federal gun laws. But here is what most people get wrong. They hear this ruling and think the conflict is over. It is not. The court did not say all marijuana users are protected in every case. The court said the DOJ could not prosecute Hemani on these facts using this broad automatic theory. That is a very different statement. Here is a hypothetical example to explain this. Imagine one person uses marijuana occasionally, keeps a firearm locked at home, has no violent history, and there is no evidence he is dangerous. That person may look more like Hemani. Now imagine someone else is heavily impaired, waving a firearm around, making threats, or there is clear proof the drug use creates a real danger. That case could look very different. The court basically left that door open. Now this is where it gets interesting. The DOJ had argued that old laws about drunk people supported modern restrictions on unlawful drug users, but the justices said the old laws were aimed at very different problems. Some involved court process. Some involved people who were truly unable to function. Some were about public disorder or moral concerns, not the exact kind of automatic lifetime disarmament the DOJ was trying to justify. So the government did not just lose because the court loves gun rights. It lost because its historical comparison was weak, and that matters beyond this one case. If the DOJ wants to defend a gun law now, it cannot just wave at old laws and say, close enough. The court wants a tighter fit. Why did the old law exist? How did it work? Who did it target? What process did it require? If those answers do not line up, the government has a problem. Now, quick legal note, this is educational information, not legal advice. Always consult an attorney for your specific situation. There is another detail in this case that a lot of media reports gloss over. The court noted the government itself had taken steps that undercut its argument. In simple terms, even the broader legal landscape has shifted. Many states have moved toward legal marijuana use in some form, and that makes it harder for the government to sell a one-size-fits-all theory that every regular marijuana user is automatically so dangerous that the Constitution allows instant disarmament. That does not mean the federal government agrees marijuana and guns are no big deal. Not at all. It means the court was looking at the real world and saying the government's broad story did not match the facts as neatly as it wanted. So what should you take from that? Simple. Do not trust headlines. Headlines are built to get clicks. The actual rule is almost always narrower, and the details are where people get into trouble. Hey, real talk for a second. A huge chunk of people watching right now are not subscribed. Do not be part of that group. Join the gun owners who come here to get the plain English version before bad information spreads everywhere. Hit subscribe and stay ahead of the next ruling. Let me give you the third part nobody is talking about. Enough, and that is what comes next. When the Supreme Court issues a narrow ruling like this, lower courts, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and gun owners all start testing the edges. That means more cases are coming, a lot more. Some courts will read Hemani broadly and say, if the government wants to disarm someone over drug use, it needs real proof that person is dangerous. Other courts may read it narrowly and say, no, Hemani only protects people in very specific fact patterns. That is how major legal fights grow. One case opens a door, then everybody argues about how wide that door really is, and do not forget Congress is still in the picture too. The court practically signaled that lawmakers could try narrower rules. For example, laws focused on actual intoxication, actual dangerousness, or more specific categories might get a different reception. So if you think this issue is settled forever, do not make that mistake. Lawmakers and prosecutors read these opinions closely. They look for the next angle. Here is what that means for you in real life. If you are a gun owner, you cannot afford to play internet lawyer with your freedom. You cannot just say, well, some guy on social media said Hemani means weed and guns are now totally fine. That is how people end up with charges they never saw coming. Imagine you are pulled over. Imagine a gun is in the vehicle. Imagine there are signs of recent drug use, or statements get made, or your state law says one thing while federal law says another. Are you really going to bet your future on a headline you saw for 6 seconds? That is the danger here. Most people want simple answers, black or white, legal or illegal, safe or unsafe, but gun law almost never works that way. One fact can change everything: where the gun was, whether it was loaded, whether there was current impairment, whether there were statements to police, whether the case is state or federal, whether the government has proof you are dangerous. These details matter, and here is something else that jumped out at me. The original search in Hemani's case was tied to suspicions of terrorism-related activity, but the gun charge the government ended up bringing was only about his gun possession while being an unlawful marijuana user. That detail matters because it shows how a case can start one way and end somewhere completely different. A government investigation can turn into a gun case fast, even if the final charge is not what you expected. So let me boil this down into 3 things you should remember. First, the DOJ took a big loss because the Supreme Court rejected its broad effort to use federal law to automatically prosecute a regular marijuana user for having a gun at home. Second, this was a narrow ruling, not a free pass. The court did not wipe out all drug-related gun restrictions, and it left room for other prosecutions and future laws. Third, confusion is now more dangerous than ever, because millions of people will hear the headline and think they understand the law when they really do not. And that is why this case matters so much. Not just because the DOJ lost, but because this ruling exposes how unstable and confusing the line has become between gun rights, federal law, and marijuana use in America. Laws change fast. Court rulings change faster than most people realize. Subscribe right now, because the next update on this issue could be the one that tells you exactly what changed, what did not, and what mistakes to avoid before this area of law shifts again. So here is the bottom line. The DOJ just suffered a major defeat in a key U.S. gun law battle, but this is not the end of the story. The Supreme Court said the government went too far in this case, yet it also made clear that many other restrictions and future fights are still alive. If you want clear, honest updates without the hype, subscribe now and stay with this channel, because when gun laws change, finding out late is not just embarrassing, it can cost you your rights, your money, and your freedom. And one final simple disclaimer: this video is for education only. It is not legal advice, and laws can change based on your state and your specific facts. If your rights or your case are on the line, talk to a qualified attorney before making any decision.